Hi guys, Pax at Bonum. So today we are going to talk about a continuation of the conditional statements, and our topic is the else if statements. So it might sound familiar because of the if else statement, but this statement is a different thing. It is also part of of conditional statements. However, the function is it digs a bit deeper regarding conditional statements. Our learning competencies today are to differentiate an if-else statement from an else-if statement. We will also analyze how HTML forms interact with JavaScript to produce an overall outcome in a web page, and we will perform conditional else-if statements in a web page. So as a motivation, I want you to think about this. Never mind the groupings, since you are an ODL student. Just put this in mind. This is our scenario. Recently, jeepney drivers went on a strike. So their wage for the day is actually not a positive number or a positive wage. So I want you to pause the video and think about the answer before proceeding. How can we say that a variable like wage is a positive number or even a negative number? And how can we say that as a condition? Now, a wage, the variable wage, to say that a number or a variable can be positive or negative is by using relational operators to compare it with a value 0. So any number that is greater than 0, that is positive. Any number that is less than 0 is negative. Now, I want you to answer this one. How should we write it in an else if statement? So if you are going to use, sorry, not else if, but rather if else statement. So if you are going to use an if else statement, we will be placing either of the two conditions inside our parentheses. So let's say we will use a greater than sign. If wage is greater than 0, it means we will display, let's say, alert, positive. And then if it is false, therefore, the variable contains a value that is negative. However, there is one problem to that. Yeah, I have written an example over here, although my example has a different condition. Now, my problem is, what if the value of the variable wage is actually 0? So let's try following the code. So if wage is 0, it's less than 0, it means this is false. This will not be performed. This one will appear on your web page. It will state that 0 wage is positive. Is that correct? Definitely, 0 is not a positive number. It is also not a negative number. 0 has no sign. So I hope you are getting what I'm pointing here. In this type of scenario, wherein we are looking for a positive or a negative and a 0, an if-else statement is not sufficient. But we can use an else-if statement so that we can introduce another option. Remember, in an if-else statement, we only have two paths. We have the path of the if, we have the path of the else. So using the topic that I will be introducing, the else if statement, we will be able to add a third or even a fourth, a fifth path for our code. So just a bit of a review. The if-else statement is performed when our condition is true, if block will be performed, but if the condition is false, the else part will be performed. Now, to write an else if statement, we actually place it in between the if and the else. And we can write as many else if statements as we want here, depending on your need. So what happens here is, if your condition is true, perform, the rest disregard. But if your condition, the first one, is false, it will check the next else if this is true or false. If this is true, perform the block, disregard the else. But if it returns false, the computer has no choice but to go to the else statement and perform it. So that's how an else if statement works. So just thinking about it, aside from the if going to one side, else going to the other side, we have an else if statement that offers us a different path. And if you add other else ifs, your code can be split up more than 3. Okay, so let's have an example. I've written here a conditional statement with else if. So let's say our wage will have a value. Let's say our wage is 0. So what will be the output? If wage is 0, in the first condition, it will return false. On the second condition, it will also return false. Therefore, the computer will display wage is 0. If our wage is 50, on the first condition, it will return true. This will be performed. The rest will be disregarded. Now, if our wage is negative, first one false, second one true, this will be performed, else will be disregarded. All right? So, let's try putting a front end to this back end. Remember, this one is JavaScript. This is not seen by users. This is actually called the back end. We will try to put a front end, whatever the user sees, in the user interface. So here is the front end part. This is our form. So this is what the user sees. I've added a function with conditional statements. This is what I've shown you earlier. So what happens is, once the user clicks, the function will be called. Inside the function, we will get the value of the text box. The ID is input. So the text box name is input. So the value of wage will be whatever is written on the text box. So in this case, what is written on the text box is -5. Because of document.getElement.value, this -5 will be saved inside the variable wage. Now, since the variable wage already has a value of -5, we can perform the conditional statement. The first one will result to false. the next else if will result to true. Since this is true, the output is an alert containing wage is negative. So that's how else if statements work. But this is using a text box. What if we use radio buttons instead? What if we use radio buttons? So just a review, radio buttons must have the same name so that you can only select one radio button among the group. You can put IDs, but the IDs must be unique to each radio button, and it may have a value that you can pull out whenever you need a value to compute for. So I will be using this radio buttons and plot else ifs. What will happen is if I select one and press check, the computer will be able to determine which is selected. Now the question I'm going to ask you is, should we get the value of the input element or the radio button? Should we get the value of the radio button? When we use document.getElement by ID, we can actually get the value of the radio buttons if we will use their particular IDs. But in this type of input element, we are actually more concerned with, is the radio button selected or not? If we are going to use a conditional statement for this one, we don't have to always check if a value for, let's say for example, if a variable is equal to 100, or if a value is equal to negative 100, or if a value is equal to 0. There is an actual simpler method to check whatever is checked among the radio button group, and that is by using document.getElement by ID dot check. So this code, document.getElement by ID dot check, will actually return a true or false value. So for example, sorry, the ID here is not question, but rather it should be either Q1, Q2, or Q3. So let's say, for example, I will write here Q1. So the ID is Q. Wait, let me just redo that again. So Q1. If the ID is Q1, we are talking about this radio button. Now, if I will select Q1, or sorry, the first one, which is Q1, this line of code will return a true value, meaning the value of this variable wage1 is true. Now, why do we need this true or false value? If this is true, it means the radio button is selected. If we will add another line, let's say we have variable wage2 and document.getElement by ID Q2, Q2 is not selected, therefore the value of it is false. So wage2 will have a value of false. So going further, if we will add the back end, the conditional statements, and this radio button input elements, we will come up with something like this. So this is now the combination of a front end and a back end. So as you can see here, I have three variables and I check whichever is checked among the three. So, for example, we will now analyze how HTML and JavaScript interact. If I select the second one and I click check, so the function check will be performed. Three variables will have values. So the first one, wage one, it will check if Q1 is checked, which is Q1, this one. So Q1, this, it will check if it is indeed selected. It's not selected, so therefore wage one will have a value of false. Wage two, it is selected. So this one, the second document that get element, will return true. And wage 3, the third radio button, Q3 is the third radio button, it will return false because it is not selected. Now, if we will proceed with the conditional statements, wage 1 equals true. Well, wage 1 is false, so this will not be performed. Wage 2 is true. Since that is true, an alert stating wage is negative will be performed. Now, with this information, let's try to put that into practice. Let's do your activity. You are a researcher for NEDA. To gauge the income of jeepney drivers, you will create a web page that checks their daily income. So you research the range of a jeepney driver's daily income. But the question there is, what are the credible sources for this type of information? Normally, when we talk about income and stuff, it will be best to check websites coming from the government, like Philippine Statistics Authority, National Economic Development Authority, or DOLE, Department of Labor and Employment. Secondary sources, probably media outlets, news outlets. So those are credible sources for information. Now what will happen is, upon button click, an alert will be shown and it will display what option you have selected. And then inside your page, whatever you have researched, you write it as a reference APA style. I have a template in your submission entry. You can use that template so that you don't have to type everything from scratch. And then as a level up task, instead of stating an alert what they have chosen, you compute for the yearly income based on their daily income selected. So when we say daily income selected, aside from using dot check, you must also use document that get element document that get element by ID dot value to get the value of the radio button, and then you compute it using this formula. Dot value, the which will be inserted inside the variable wage, multiply it by 365, place it in a new variable, and then you display that using alert. So here is a sample output. So there must be questions. Minimum number of radio buttons, 3, maximum 5. Again, once you submit, the computer must be able to determine which among the 3 is selected. So you have to use document.getElementById by ID dot check. And then in your conditional statements, you just look for any true value. And then also put your reference. And then after you do the activity, continue this video. We will recap. So let's recap now. This is the solution. And let's try to describe how else-if statements is different compared to an if-else statement. So if-else statement, they provide 2 options. One for the if, the block of the if, one for the block of else, depending on the condition. Again, if the condition is true, we perform the if. If the condition is false, we perform the else statement. Now, an else if statement, it adds a third option, a third or more options compared to the if and else. And how do HTML forms interact with JavaScript with the survey you created? So probably you may have an idea that when you select an input radio that is part of HTML, you will be able to transfer the value true or false by using the JavaScript code document.getElementById dot check. So when you use that code, you will now transfer to JavaScript, and from then you will be able to perform conditional statements, and then you display using alert going back to the native side of HTML. And then I want you to think about the answers to this valuing. I won't be able to answer this for you, but conditional statements are like cause and effect. What value should we learn from this? And then I want you to reflect on this as well. If we remove jeepneys along the road, what will be the effect to the drivers and to us commuters? And lastly, I want you to think about what have you learned today. Announcement, next week, there will be a post test, mostly about code analysis. And then we will start mini task number 2. We will do that for the week. And then we will also start with the instruction of the grand task. And then the following week, we will do the grand task.